Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about aviation safety.
Okay.
Specifically, the challenge of bird strikes. I'm sure you've heard of them. Yeah, those moments when a bird and a plane have a little bit of a disagreement in the sky.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's more than just a minor inconvenience. These incidents actually cost the U.S. civil aviation industry, get this, a staggering amount each year.
Oh, wow.
Hundreds of millions of dollars in damages.
Really?
Yeah. So today, we're going to be unpacking some groundbreaking research from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. They took a really innovative approach to understanding and managing bird strike risk.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's a fascinating case study, you know. It really highlights the need to think outside the box, go beyond those traditional methods. Because, as you said, bird strikes are a serious concern for airports worldwide. And Seattle-Tacoma really decided to push the boundaries of how we assess that risk.
So what was the standard approach back in the day, and why did Seattle-Tacoma feel the need to kind of shake things up a little bit?
Well, for years, the go-to method was what we call the point count survey. Basically, researchers would spend, just a few minutes observing birds in a specific area, usually wetlands near the runways, which, gives you a snapshot. But it doesn't really paint the whole picture, right, of how those birds are actually using the airspace, especially that critical zone where those planes are taking off and landing.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. So they needed a more kind of comprehensive view. Tell me about this new approach, this innovative approach that came up with at Seattle-Tacoma.
Right. So they developed something called the Runway Protection Zone Survey, or RPZ survey for short. Basically, picture like a designated safety zone that extends out from each end of the runway, right?
Okay.
That's where the risk is highest, obviously. And researchers at Seattle-Tacoma decided, you know what? We need to focus on this zone to really get a detailed understanding of what's happening in that airspace.
Okay, I'm already intrigued. So how did they actually conduct these RPZ surveys? Was it anything beyond the typical binoculars and notepads?
Oh, definitely not your average bird watching, that's for sure. They combined the traditional point count surveys with these much more intensive 20-minute RPZ observations.
Oh, wow.
And during these observations, they would record everything about the birds in that zone, the species, flock sizes, altitude, even their specific flight paths. And then they'd use geographic information systems, or GIS, to map and analyze those paths.
Wow, GIS for birds. That's impressive. So they weren't just noting, the types of birds. They were literally mapping their movements in the sky.
Exactly.
With incredible precision.
It was all about understanding how those birds were using that space around the runways. And get this, they even grouped the birds into 14 categories based on their shared characteristics and their potential for damage.
Oh, this is where things get even more interesting.
Okay, I'm hooked. Lay it on me. What kind of insights did they glean from all this data?
All right, well, first they had to crunch the numbers, right? They took all that frequency data from both types of surveys, how often they observed each bird group, and they combined that with information on bird strike damage from the FAA's national database. And this allowed them to come up with a risk score for each bird group, focusing on the potential damage if a strike were to occur. Not necessarily the probability of a strike, but the consequences,
I see. Okay, so they were quantifying the risk in a new way. What did they find? Any big surprises?
Well, both surveys identified waterfowl, corvids, your crows and ravens, gulls, and Canada geese as being pretty high risk. No big surprises there.
Yeah, right. Those are kind of the usual suspects when you think about airports.
Right, exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. The RPZ surveys revealed something that the traditional point count surveys had completely missed.
Oh.
Raptors.
Yeah, hawks, eagles, falcons. These birds were using that critical airspace way more frequently than anyone had realized.
Whoa, okay, that's a game changer. Raptors aren't typically what come to mind when you think about bird strikes. So those quick point counts were actually giving a full sense of security when it came to those birds.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, the RPZ data showed just how active they were in that airspace. And this was further validated when they checked the actual bird strike records at Seattle-Tacoma. The records confirmed what the RPZ surveys had uncovered. Raptors were causing a significant number of strikes.
Interesting. So the RPZ surveys uncovered a blind spot, you could say, in our understanding of bird strike risk. That has huge implications for safety. But I'm curious, what were some of the key factors they considered when they were grouping those birds?
That's a great question. You got to think about it. Different bird species have vastly different characteristics: size, weight, flocking behavior, Flight speed, altitude, all these things come into play, right? In terms of how much damage a bird could cause in a collision.
Yeah, of course.
So they took all of those factors into account when they created those 14 groups. They wanted to compare apples to apples, so to speak.
Right. You wouldn't want to lump a tiny sparrow in with a massive bald eagle when you're talking about strike risk.
Exactly. And that's what makes these findings so important. They showed that relying solely on those traditional point count surveys could lead to a dangerously incomplete understanding of the risks, especially for those species like raptors that use the airspace differently.
Okay, this is all fascinating. But before we move on, I want to kind of rewind a little bit and just break down exactly how those RPZ surveys were structured. I'm really curious about the specifics.
Of course, yeah. So remember, they were using two different methods simultaneously. You had those quick point count surveys and then the more intensive RPZ surveys. And for those RPZ surveys, they would choose a specific location within that runway protection zone. It could be a field, a wetland, even a forested area. Any place that offered a good vantage point for observing the airspace.
Okay, so they were strategically positioning themselves
Right.
to capture kind of a wide range of bird activity.
Exactly. And then for a full 20 minutes, they would meticulously observe and record all the bird activity, the species, the size of each flock, how high they were flying, the direction of their flight path. It really gave them a much richer data set than those quick point counts.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like they were creating a detailed snapshot of bird behavior within that zone. What happened once they had all that data? How'd they analyze it?
That's where the GIS technology came in. They used it to map out those flight paths, essentially creating a visual representation of how different bird species were using the airspace above the runways, like air traffic control, but for birds.
I love that image.
Yeah, and by comparing those maps to the data from the point count surveys, they were able to identify patterns and discrepancies that would have otherwise gone unnoticed.
Oh, I see. I'm already starting to see how valuable this approach is, but we've been diving deep into the methods here. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what it all means. What were the key takeaways, and why should our listeners care?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think what's fascinating here is not just the innovative methodology, but what those findings actually mean, right, for you, the listener. Understanding how this risk is assessed can give you a better appreciation for the complexities of managing wildlife near airports.
Yeah, you know what? It makes me wonder, what else were we missing? If we're just scratching the surface with these traditional methods, what other hidden risks might be lurking out there?
That's a really good question. And it really speaks to the need for continued innovation and a willingness to challenge our assumptions, right? Especially when it comes to safety. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have a lot to unpack from this Seattle-Tacoma research.
Yeah, you're right. Before we move on, I think it's important to highlight the importance of this research for our listeners. It's not just about birds and planes. It's about a deeper understanding of risk itself and how we can use data to make better decisions, whether it's in aviation, transportation, or any other field where safety is paramount.
Absolutely. Yeah, the implications of this research go far beyond just the realm of aviation. It's a reminder that we can't rely on those outdated methods to address complex challenges.
Well said. Well, I think it's time to dive even deeper into the findings. What else did those researchers uncover? And how did it impact the way Seattle-Tacoma approaches bird strike risk management?
Well, one of the most significant outcomes was kind of a shift in perspective. Before this research, bird strike risk management was largely focused on those species that were frequently seen near runways. Waterfowl, gulls, things like that. They were the main targets.
Yeah, makes sense. Those are the birds you typically see kind of hanging around airports.
Right, exactly. But the RPZ surveys revealed that that was not enough. Raptors, with their different flight patterns and behaviors, had been flying under the radar, literally.
Yeah, it's a classic case of out of sight, out of mind. So how did this newfound understanding of raptor risk change things at Seattle-Tacoma?
It prompted them to reassess their entire approach to wildlife management. They realized that those traditional methods, like habitat modification and harassment techniques, which worked well for those ground-dwelling birds, weren't going to cut it for raptors.
Right, because raptors aren't hanging out on the runways or in nearby fields. They're soaring high above, often unseen.
Exactly. So Seattle-Tacoma had to get creative. They started exploring new strategies, specifically tailored to raptors.
Like what?
Well, one approach involved using trained falcons, to actually deter other raptors from entering the airspace around the airport.
Whoa, so they're fighting fire with fire, so to speak.
Yeah.
Using one type of raptor to manage another.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how understanding behavior can lead to innovative solutions. And it's not just about those reactive measures either. The research also highlighted the importance of being proactive.
Okay, so like what? What kind of proactive measures can an airport take to reduce those raptor strikes?
Well, one key area is habitat management. By understanding what attracts raptors to the area around an airport. Things like open fields for hunting or tall trees for nesting, they can make modifications to make it less appealing.
Oh, I see. So it's about discouraging them from setting up shop near the airport in the first place.
Precisely. It's a more holistic approach to wildlife management, and it underscores the value of understanding not just the birds themselves, but the entire ecosystem they inhabit.
Okay, so Seattle-Tacoma took their findings and really ran with them. New strategies, a broader perspective, it's really impressive. But this was just one airport. What about the bigger picture? How has this research influenced the way other airports approach bird strike risk?
Well, it's had a ripple effect throughout the entire industry. The findings have prompted airports worldwide to reevaluate their own risk assessment methods and their wildlife management strategies. The RPZ survey has become a valuable tool. It gives us a much more nuanced understanding of bird activity around runways.
So it's not just about adopting the exact methods used at Seattle-Tacoma. It's about applying the underlying principles to different environments.
Exactly. Each airport has its own unique set of challenges, right, and its own ecosystem. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution. But the key takeaway here is the importance of going beyond those traditional methods and embracing a more comprehensive, data-driven approach.
Yeah, data really is king, isn't it? It allows us to see things we might otherwise miss and to make more informed decisions.
Absolutely. And when it comes to safety, having that right data can be the difference between a near miss and a disaster. But data alone isn't enough. We also need to be willing to learn from it, right? To adapt our strategies and to constantly challenge our assumptions.
That's a powerful message. We can't become complacent. We need to constantly be evolving and refining our approach, especially in a field as dynamic as aviation. But before we wrap up our deep dive into this groundbreaking research, I have one final question. We've talked a lot about the scientific aspects of bird strike risk, but what about the human element? How do pilots factor into all of this?
That's a really important point. Pilots play a critical role in mitigating this risk. They're the ones on the front lines, so to speak, and their training and awareness are essential.
So it's not just about technology and data. It's about human skill and judgment as well.
Absolutely. Pilots undergo rigorous training to recognize and avoid those potential strikes. They're taught to be aware of bird activity, to understand the risks associated with different species, and to know how to react quickly and effectively if they do encounter birds.
So they're not just flying planes, they're essentially bird watchers in the sky.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, they have to be constantly vigilant, scanning the skies, making split-second decisions. And the research we've been discussing plays a crucial role in informing their training and helping them make those decisions.
That makes sense. Knowledge is power, especially when you're hurtling through the air at hundreds of miles per hour. But what about the technology in the cockpit? Are there any systems in place to actually help pilots avoid bird strikes?
There certainly are. Modern aircraft are equipped with a variety of systems designed to kind of enhance that situational awareness and help them avoid collisions.
Like what? What kind of technology are we talking about?
Well, one example is weather radar, which can actually detect large flocks of birds, especially during those migration seasons.
Oh, wow. So the same technology that helps pilots navigate through storms can also help them avoid, like, bird-filled skies.
Exactly. And there are other systems as well, like infrared cameras, that can detect the heat signatures of birds, even in low-light conditions.
Wow. So technology is playing an increasingly important role in all of this.
It is. But it's important to remember that technology is just one piece of the puzzle, It's a tool, not a solution.
Right. So we still need those skilled pilots and that comprehensive data and proactive strategies to truly mitigate the risk. It's a multifaceted challenge that requires a multifaceted approach.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored this groundbreaking research at Seattle-Tacoma. We've delved into that innovative RPZ survey. And we've discussed the far-reaching implications for aviation safety.
It's been a really enlightening discussion.
It certainly has. But before we conclude our deep dive, I'd like to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question to ponder. We've talked about data, technology, pilot training, all these pieces of the puzzle. But what about the future? As technology keeps advancing and air traffic keeps increasing, what new challenges might we face when it comes to bird strikes? And what kind of innovations might be on the horizon to address those challenges?
That's a question that keeps a lot of aviation experts up at night. The landscape is constantly changing. We need to be thinking ahead.
So what's next? What's the next frontier in bird strike prevention?
Well, one area that I think holds a lot of promise is artificial intelligence, AI. Imagine AI-powered systems that can analyze these huge amounts of data in real time, predicting bird movements and alerting pilots to potential hazards before they even take off.
Okay, that sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Right.
But it's not that far-fetched, is it?
Not at all. The technology is already being developed. We're talking about sophisticated algorithms that can track weather patterns, bird migration routes, even analyze historical bird strike data, and use all that to create these highly accurate predictive models.
So we could potentially have a system that, says, hey, there's a high likelihood of encountering a flock of geese in your approach to runway 27.
Yeah.
Adjust your flight path accordingly.
Exactly. It'd be like having a virtual bird strike expert in the cockpit, providing that real-time guidance and really enhancing pilot decision-making.
That's incredible. But what about drones? They're becoming more and more prevalent. How are they impacting bird strike risk?
That's another piece of the puzzle. Drones are a relatively new variable, right? We're still learning about their potential impact on both bird populations and aviation safety.
So more research is needed.
Absolutely. We need to understand how birds react to drones, whether they actually pose a threat to aircraft, and how we can safely integrate them into our airspace. It's a complex challenge, but it's one that we definitely can't ignore.
It's a reminder that as technology advances, so do the challenges we face. And we need to be proactive in addressing those challenges, just like the researchers at Seattle-Tacoma were with their innovative RPZ survey.
Absolutely. It's all about staying ahead of the curve, constantly innovating, and always striving for a safer, more efficient airspace.
Well said. Well, I think we've landed our deep dive on a thought-provoking note. We've explored the complexities of bird strike risk, uncovered the importance of these data-driven approaches, and even gotten a glimpse into the future of aviation safety.
Yeah, it's been great.
It's been a pleasure soaring through this topic with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
As always, we encourage our listeners to continue exploring. You can find links to the research we discussed and other fascinating resources on bird strikes in the show notes. And stay tuned for our next deep dive, where we'll be tackling a whole new topic.
Until next time, keep those wings up and those minds curious.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll catch you on the next descent. We've talked about the critical role of data, technology, and pilot training in mitigating bird strike risk. But what about the future? As technology advances and air traffic continues to increase, what new challenges might we face? And what innovations might be on the horizon to address those challenges?
That's a question that keeps aviation experts up at night. The landscape is constantly changing, and we need to stay ahead of the curve.
So what's next? What's the next frontier in bird strike prevention?
One area that holds immense promise is artificial intelligence. Imagine AI-powered systems that can analyze vast amounts of data in real time, predicting bird movements and alerting pilots to potential hazards before they even take off.
That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. But it's not that far-fetched, is it?
Not at all. The technology is already being developed. We're talking about sophisticated algorithms that can track weather patterns, bird migration routes, and even analyze historical bird strike data to create these highly accurate predictive models.
So we could potentially have a system that says, hey, there's a high likelihood of encountering a flock of geese on your approach to runway 27. Adjust your flight path accordingly.
Exactly. It would be like having a virtual bird strike expert in the cockpit, providing real-time guidance and enhancing pilot decision-making.
That's incredible. But what about drones? They're becoming increasingly prevalent. How are they impacting bird strike risk?
That's another piece of the evolving puzzle. Drones are a relatively new variable, and we're still learning about their potential impact on bird populations and aviation safety.
Some more research is needed.
Absolutely. We need to understand how birds react to drones, whether they pose a threat to aircraft, and how we can integrate them safely into our airspace. It's a complex challenge, but it's one that we can't ignore.
It's a reminder that as technology advances, so do the challenges we face.
Mm.
And we need to be proactive in addressing those challenges, just like the researchers at Seattle-Tacoma were with their innovative RPZ survey.
Well said. It's all about staying ahead of the curve, constantly innovating, and always striving for a safer, more efficient airspace.
Well, I think we've landed our deep dive on a thought-provoking note. We've explored the intricacies of bird strike risk, uncovered the importance of data-driven approaches, and even glimpsed into the future of aviation safety.
It's been a pleasure soaring through this topic with you.
The pleasure was all mine. As always, we encourage our listeners to continue exploring. You can find links to the research we discussed and other fascinating resources on bird strikes in the show notes. And stay tuned for our next deep dive, where we'll be tackling a whole new topic.
Until next time, keep those wings up and those minds curious.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll catch you on the next descent.